He was born on July 12, 1904, in a town called Pereira, in the southern part of Chile. His father was a railroad employee and his mother was a teacher, who died shortly after his birth. Some years after his mother died, his father moved them to a town called Tumaco. This is where he spent his childhood and youth. At the age of 13, he became a poet and a journalist. At the early age of 13, he began to contribute some articles to the newspaper The Daily.
La Mañana.
His very first publication was a poem called
Entusiasmo y perseverancia.
translated to English, Enthusiasm and Perseverance. Neruda's father opposed of his son's interest in writing poetry and literature. His father wanted him to have a practical life, as his father believed there was no future in writing. But between 1918 and 1920, Neruda's passion for writing led him to publish numerous poems and essays in the local magazines and newspapers. In 1920, Neftali legally adopted his pen name Pablo Neruda to avoid his disapproval of his father. It said that he chose Neruda in honor and memory of the late Juan Neruda, who also was a famous poet and journalist. By this time, Pablo Neruda was a published author of poetry and journalism. In 1920, Neftali legally adopted his pen name Pablo Neruda to avoid the disapproval of his father. It said that he chose Neruda in honor and memory of the late Juan Neruda, who also was a famous poet and journalist. By this time, Pablo Neruda was a published author of poetry and journalism. Some of the poems from Neruda's early years in poetry are said to be found in his first published book,
Crepúsculo Rio.
translated to English meaning twilight. The following year, 1924, Neruda published his book,
20 poemas de amor y una canción desesperada.
translated in English, 20 love poems and a song of despair. This book known as one of his best known and most translated works. In 1932, he published his second edition. Neruda studied French and pedagogy at the University of Chile in Santiago. Between 1927 and 1935, the government put him in charge of a number of honorary consulships, which led him to
Burma, Ceylon, Java, Singapore, Buenos Aires, Barcelona, and Madrid.
his poetic production during that difficult period included, among other works, the collection of historic surrealistic poems he published in his book,
Residencia en la Tierra.
translated into English, Residence on Earth, which is another one of his books translated into several different languages. The Spanish Civil War and the execution of his close friend Federico Garcia Lorca, who was a famous poet and theater director, affected him strongly. This made him want and did join the Republican movement, first in Spain and later in France. Horrified by the Civil War and the death of his friend, and becoming a Republican diplomat, this influenced him to work on his most politically passionate series of poems. He published the
España en el corazón.
translated in English, Spain in Our Hearts. Over the next 10 years, Neruda was traveling back and forth from Chile, as he was named Chile's consul to Mexico, and won election to Chile's Senate. But then, in 1945, he had to flee Chile as the Communist Party was under siege. Through his difficult situation, he published 250 poems in his book called
Canto General.
Translated in English, Overall Song. Pablo finished writing his book,
Los versos de Capitán.
in English terms, The Captain's Verses. In 1952, while on exile on the island of Capri, Italy, surrounded by the sea, sun, and Capri's natural splendors, A lot of these poems were addressed to his wife Matilde before they were married, but he didn't publish them publicly until 1963. In this book, The Captain's Verses is a poem called
Si tú me olvidas.
Translated in English, If You Forget Me. It's said to be dedicated to his wife Matilde. His wife believes a lot of poems, and this poem in particular came from Neruda's insecurities about her, but this is not the case. The poems in the book of
100 Sentimientos de Amor,
translated in English, 100 Love Sonnets, were written for Neruda's wife Matilde. If You Forget Me was written during his exile from his country, Chile, to remind them of the love he has for his homeland. Pablo's pain for having to leave his country is clear. If You Forget Me is an exemplar in the world of literature, not just because of the beautiful use of the language, but also the variety of literacy devices used. The most prominent literacy device used in the poem and most of his poems are metaphors. The poem starts off with, I want you to know one thing. The poem begins with a sharp line indicating that whatever the poet wants to be known holds importance. It also initiates an interest in the reader to proceed with the poem. These lines from the poem says, well, now if little by little you start loving me, I shall start loving you little by little. He's explaining his feelings towards his native country, Chile, throughout this poem. During the time of the Civil War and his active participation, a warrant was put out for his arrest. Therefore, he was to leave his native land, Chile. He says that although his roots were planted in Chile, the current situations have destroyed everything, and the poet has no option left other than uprooting and starting afresh elsewhere. If You Forget Me explains his pain and suffering that he experienced during this time in his life, not a jealousy towards his wife.